Okay, hi everybody. As I promised Thursday, I think was the last time I saw you, I said that I would be putting on, uploading one more set of comments about cognition, that is to begin with. And here it is. So I wanted to say first that it is quite a little difficult for me to be talking about cognition from a Piagetian point of view through on an online course, actually, and I'll tell you why. I think you noticed, hopefully you have noticed that the Piagetian task that at least I gave to the children that you saw, for example, that tube task, or the task where which the child gave actually to himself, that is the child with Down syndrome, where he was popping beads together and separating them out. And even the third task where the little girl, also with Down syndrome, was decided to undress Babar and wear the clothes. Those three tasks represent Piagetian type tasks, and they involve the manipulation of concrete material. They do not involve speaking first and presenting problems by talking. Rather, they have to do with identifying problems that involve physical objects. For example, I'm going to refer in a minute to the classic Piaget conservation of continuous quantity task. All of Piaget's tasks involve physical objects that people manipulate, at least until the individuals get to what's used to be termed the formal operational stage. At that point, problems become verbal. Now, is this important? And the answer is extremely important, because it's very important to me, first of all, that you distinguish in this course on language disorders in children the difference between a task that has a physical, manipulable component to it and one that involves just talking, like I'm doing with you here online. As I teach, the way I'm teaching you is I'm talking at you, and I'm therefore expecting you to take the symbolic material that I'm coming out of my mouth and dig through that and extract the meaning from it. On the other hand, if I gave you a physical problem to solve, you wouldn't just have words to deal with, but you had to have objects and feedback, that is information that would come from your manipulation of these objects. And let me say that verbal problem solving from an information processing point of view seems to me to be much more complex than problem solving that is grounded in real material. Also, if a child has a language delay or a language problem, it would be important to come up with ways for the individual to develop intellectually that would not involve exclusively talking or maybe reading material, that is symbolic material. It would be nice if individuals would have another place to go, another way to extract knowledge. And so the Piagetian tasks represent that. And the idea that these tasks are physical really captures a fundamental principle of Piaget's point of view about cognition. And that is that knowledge, conscious knowledge, and language, particularly the content of language, is grounded in physical sensory motor action. That is, the physical movements, the physical action, and the information we get through feedback from our senses as we manipulate objects to achieve goals and overcome problems. That's what leads to the development of more complex cognition. I hope you're following that. That is, again, content of mind is grounded in feedback from physical material of one sort or another through our own physical actions. And the kinds of things we do when we set goals for ourselves and identify problems and try to resolve problems, the things we do is create relationships. And we organize, we create relationships. And remember that relationship making was what I identified as the basis of language content. That is the ideation that kids express. And relationship making is the basis of the Leahy content categories. Now, think about it for a second. Existence, the category of existence, that very much corresponds to object permanence, recognizing an object. What kind of a relationship do you need to make to recognize that an object exists? Well, you have to separate it out from everything else. And relationship making is both bringing things together and separating them out. So you have to separate out the object from its surroundings and bring together those parts of the object that belong to the object. Think about attribution, the content category attribution. You have to separate out the object and a component or part of the object that is an attribute of the object. So you could have a circle, a Play-Doh ball. You have a Play-Doh ball, and you can have the attribute of the ball, which is its color, white, or its shape, round. So you have the object, ball, and its attribute. That's a relationship. Locative action. That's a relationship between one location and another, or the object and its location, or the object's beginning location and its final location. For example, the ball fell down. That's a relationship between its initial position and its final position, which is down. And in the more inter-event content categories, you certainly have relationships, temporal relations, causal relations, epistemic relations, and those children achieve those from a Piagetian point of view through goal setting and physical manipulation of objects in the real world. And they develop content of mind by representing features of objects through feedback from their own action. Feedback means information they get from their sensory, through their senses, as a consequence of action. And that feedback can be proprioceptive, tactile, visual, auditory, etc. So I hope we're following that. I hope you can follow what I'm saying. If there's any questions, please bring it up when we actually meet face to face. There is one additional point I want to make about the Piagetian approach to cognition, which I am stressing here because I view cognition as a factor that could be maintaining a language delay in children, and that would need to be addressed in an intervention. So we're looking at cognition. And the second part of cognition, the second point that I want to make here is that all of the Piagetian tasks have a certain quality to them. And that is, in addition to involving physical objects, they challenge the child or the adult, if we're the ones doing the task, they challenge the problem solver to pay attention to more than one place at once. That is very important. They challenge the individual to pay attention to be aware of, to be cognizant of more than one thing at once. That's not to say the individual will do that, but it means I'm saying the individual is challenged to do that. And by doing that, the individual will be able to make a relationship that leads to a resolution of the problem that has been posed. So think about, first of all, the task again that I gave the child with the doll in the tube. And there, where was the child challenged to attend in order to remember that the doll remained in the tube? There was still a doll there, because I thought there was a question in my mind as to whether this child had object permanence. Well, to recognize that a displaced object exists, you have to be thinking both of the object you're seeing, which is the cover of it, on it, the thing that it's displaced under, and the object itself. And you kind of have to visualize it going in and out. That is the object that's been hidden, in and out, reversing in and out, and separating out from the object that covers it. If you can't keep your mind on the two objects, but instead focus only on one, the second object disappears. Or take this particular classic Piagetian task again. This is the conservation of continuous quantity task. The way the task is presented to children, classically, the child is asked actually to create two balls out of clay, these days Play-Doh, and asked, do you agree, you would ask the child, they're the same now, there's the same amount of Play-Doh in this ball and this ball. I want you to make sure that there is the same amount. I'm trying to focus the camera on this, but the camera's on the video, the camera's on the computer, so it's a little challenging. So you show the child the two parts and you say, do you agree that there's the same exact amount of Play-Doh in this ball and this ball? You can even have the child weigh them, each of them, to make sure that the weight is the same on either side. So the child would agree that it's the same amount and they weigh the same. They're really both made of the same Play-Doh. Then what you say to the child is, you do the following. You say, watch what I'm going to do, watch. And you take one of the two balls and do something like roll it out. As the child watches, or you can even ask the child, you make a snake out of this ball here. Look, let's make something like this. Okay, now look, we have this Play-Doh and this Play-Doh. Now I would say, is there still the same amount of Play-Doh in each of these figures, in the snake and in the ball? Or isn't there now more Play-Doh here? Or is there more Play-Doh here? What would you say? Now, to answer that question, that seems obvious to you and I, perhaps, that there is obviously the same amount. We started with the same batch, equal amounts of Play-Doh. Young children, if they don't conserve, say 4 or 5, even 6-year-olds maybe, might say that now there's more Play-Doh here. And the reason is, you might ask them why. Why do you think there's more Play-Doh here than here now? Child might say, well, look, this is really narrow here, and this one's really long. Then I might then take the Play-Doh and reconfigure it, or ask the child, go ahead, make a circle now out of it, make a ball out of it. Now is there the same amount, or more or less in this one or this one? You probably would get, well, now there's the same amount. You and I would say, obviously there's the same amount regardless of how you configure the Play-Doh. A child who conserves would say such a thing. The question I have is, what are we attending to that allows us to know, to recognize that the amount of Play-Doh stays the same even though the configuration changes? What are we paying attention to? And the answer comes out if I ask you, why do you say that the amount stays the same? I could even challenge you and say, hey, it looks to me like this is way long, and this one is very short, So there really shouldn't, isn't there more Play-Doh here? What would you say as compared to this? Well, you would say, perhaps you just said that, well, it's longer, but it's narrower. This one's shorter, but it's fatter. Longer and narrower means you're paying attention not just to the one dimension of this Play-Doh snake here, but two dimensions simultaneously, long and thin. Or not only that, you're still perhaps comparing this one with this one, its initial state and its final state. And you can even imagine that this particular Play-Doh ball, when it's made into a snake, can be reversed back into a ball. So you're making relationships between these two balls, between this ball in its beginning and final state, and perhaps between the two dimensions of the snake when it becomes a snake, long and thin versus short but fat. Following me? My point is this: Piagetian tasks challenge children or adults, anybody who's engaged with these tasks, to pay attention to more than one variable at a single time and make relationships between these variables so that when things change, other things are recognized as remaining constant. That is relationship making. That also creates consistency and constancy in one's world. It also allows us to identify objects or attributes or states that may not have been recognized or identifiable if we were paying attention only to one thing at any particular time. Now, at a certain state, Piaget's original stages, at the pre-operational stage, children tend to pay attention really to only one thing at a particular time, usually an observable quality of something, such as, for example, the length, the observable quality that jumps out at them. And they're unable at that point to recognize that the amount of Play-Doh remains the same, so to speak. But when they get a little older or get a little more experience and become able to pay attention to multiple variables or components of the material at one time, they're able to recognize that, well, even though the Play-Doh changed in shape, the amount of content of that Play-Doh remained the same. One more point I want to make then is that these Piaget, I'm referring to, in this case, a classic Piagetian task related to an aspect of logic that Piaget studied, and that is continuous quantity, conservation of continuous quantity. But I want to stress that Piagetian type experiences occur every day throughout children's play, throughout children's experiences, throughout our experiences. We're always running into situations where we're not noticing something, or we're setting goals for ourselves. And in order to achieve our goals, we need to make relationships and bring things together and separate things out and recognize things in the process and identify problems and overcome problems. These things occur all the time. They're a regular part of life. And by ourselves engaging with these kinds of experiences and using the feedback we get, that is the information we get as we engage in these kinds of goal-setting, problem-solving tasks, we develop the ability to make more complex relationships mentally, which allows us to create more complex ideation, content of mind, sentences to represent this material, and That is why I want to identify cognition in the Piagetian sense as a potential maintaining factor in a language delay, and also stress its importance in considering assessment and treatment. I will come back to this subject again when we look at literacy and children with learning disabilities. This particular lecture component that I'm putting together right now for you is coming at the end of the segment of the course on moderate to severe language delay. And with kids with a more severe delay, where there's cognitive involvement and the cognitive involvement is more intense, the kinds of relationship making we are focusing on in treatment and in assessment would be the kinds related to the development of means-end behavior, means-end relationships, those kinds of relationships that support object permanence, which is, again, the separating out of objects from other objects that tend to displace them. Recurrence kinds of relationships, where you're bringing back something that's disappeared. Action relationships, location relationships, and the beginnings of attribution relationships and state relationships. Thank you. That's as far as I'm going to go right now. I will continue on with this at a future date.